Hello and welcome to the Multilingual Theatre Meet the World event. I'm JC and I'll be talking to you with my friends and colleagues, Lanaire and Siana, and we're all members of African Women Playwrights Network, the Diaspora branch. So before we dive in, I'm going to ask first Lanaire and then Siana to tell you a little bit about their work, and then we're going to talk about multilingual theatre.
Hello, everyone. My name is lanaire, and I am a writer and researcher committed to amplifying and archiving untold stories. I explore stories through different forms, from film to theater to even essays and short stories. And a lot of my work incorporates multiple languages. So, for instance, my play, Protest Hymns and Caskets, which was shortlisted for the Mustafa Matura Award, combined Pidgin English and Yoruba, and also English to tell a story about a Nigerian historical movement called the Egba Women's Revolt. And this was shown at the Belgrade Theatre to over 300 people in Coventry. I'm very passionate about language. I think that language is powerful and is an important part of storytelling. And I take inspiration from one of my favorite writers, Shange, who talks about undoing language. And I think that undoing language is a key part of what I try to do in my own work. So thank you, JC, for this.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll talk a bit more about undoing language during the course of our conversation. Siana, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everyone. Lanaire, a beautiful introduction from you. So my name is Siana Bangura. Similarly, I am very much a multidisciplinary artist. I'm a writer, a producer, and a theatre maker. And all of my work is very much grounded unashamedly in socio-political issues and really interrogating the intersection of race, class, gender, and matters kind of surrounding that. My recent works from Auntie Swim, that really has been taking over my life for a few years now. But in terms of the context of this conversation, it definitely is the culmination of my practice of playing with language, of playing with creoles, of playing with the different ways we can expand English, especially as Black diasporans, especially as African diasporans, and how we can challenge what is seen as proper language, I suppose, and proper ways to communicate, and how we can uplift our cultures through the words we use and through our dialects, and kind of how our cultures are rich and they travel as we do. So yeah, very interested in kind of that intersection of language, of culture, of identity, and particularly as a Sierra Leonean British writer, it's been very important to kind of bring our particular Creole to stage in a way that you don't often see, especially as a country that is maybe smaller on the continent and maybe less known to some. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background and my practice.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll also share a little bit about what brought me to this and how I ended up being involved in hosting this Meet the World event. So my name is JC Niala, and I took part in a virtual residency called Visible Communities. And during that time, I was translating a play called Wimbi la Mabadiliko, which means a wave of change, written by Dennis Shonko, who's a Kenyan playwright. And during the recent protest in Kenya in 2024, language and translation was used as a tool. So for the first time in Kenyan's history, Generation Z or Gen Z went around and translated into all of Kenya's major languages all of the materials that people were protesting about, the contested finance bill. And it was amazing to kind of see, as you said, Siana, language is political. And translation was used as a tool to educate people about their rights and to make sure that they weren't being left behind in any of the conversation. So working as a diaspora theatre maker, it felt really apt during this residency to be using translation to bring Dennis Shonko's work, which was then performed at Jermyn Street Theatre in January in 2024. So all of us, incorporate multiple languages and linguistic diversity into our work. But sometimes it can be quite a challenging thing to do because we have to think about our audiences. We have to think about what people will understand, but also what they might not understand. So I would love you both to share a little bit about the choices that you make, practicalities. How do you make sure that an international audience will be following the kind of things and will be getting the messages you want them to get when you're working across multiple languages?
I don't mind chiming in on that first. It's such a good question. And do you know what? First and foremost, it's an ongoing practice and it's an ongoing decision you review every single time. So I think what I've learned and I've accepted and I'm comfortable with is that there are things that are universal themes, and the way we communicate without words. So what I found is particular themes of love, of grief, they are universal. And I find with every audience in every context, myself included, even when I witness and enjoy works, music, theatre, anything that I don't necessarily understand the language word for word, I think I still get the emotion. I think this is something that I've seen through my own work. That said, though, again, these choices you make, I guess it's about subverting who the majority has always been and subverting who the focus has always been, shall we say. So I remember when I was writing Smarty Swim and the editing process and thinking about even these choices about what do you italicize Creole? And I'm not actually Nigerian myself, but I did extensive research for my Nigerian character and worked with others to make sure that, and Ghanaian characters too, to make sure that the Twi, the Yoruba that we were sprinkling in made a lot of sense. And it was such a beautiful eye-opening experience too, and daunting at times because you really wanted to get the job done well. But we had to decide, actually, no, like, we're not going to italicize or we're not going to necessarily translate. Like, people will have to get it. And if you're in the audience and you're taken by surprise, and you're like, oh my God, I understand that. That's Yoruba, or I understand that. That's Tree. That's something that's so delightful, because otherwise you don't usually get those moments. Otherwise, in spaces where you're usually the minority, you're usually not thought about, you're usually not centered. So for me, it's interesting. And even if we think about kind of like Black British English for a moment, I think about that a lot too, like in my work when deciding to write in our particular ways that we speak, and using particular slangs or using particular turns of phrases, right? You see this as well, like these choices being made on TV, etc. The question is, when do you translate yourself? How do you translate yourself? Do you want to translate yourself, especially as we people who always have to translate ourselves? So it's an ongoing dialogue with myself, when I think about whether I intentionally try to translate what I'm saying or not, or if I kind of just leave it in the air and let those who get it, they get it. It's for us, by us. And those who don't, it's okay. Like, they'll get it in its essence, basically. And if they don't, their job is to maybe go out there and find out more. Their job is to maybe ask questions. Their job is to open their own kind of horizons and maybe learn a little bit more about kind of the culture that they've been invited to be a guest in at that time.
Yeah, I can really relate to that. And I love what you said, Siana, about this invitation. I think that the theatre for me has always been a communal space, but also a playground for experimentation and ideation. And I think that part of being a part of a playground is, um, when you have to play in a space, you're also supposed to be childlike, and there are things you wouldn't understand and things you do understand. Metaphorically speaking, sometimes some people choose to go on the swings whilst others go on the sides. And I think that there's something so beautiful about how the theatre can be a space for listening and speaking, but also, um, as you said, if you don't understand a language, it's okay, because the languages that we often use, so it's particularly West African languages, for instance, like Yoruba, are very rhythmic, and is often a use of what. Yes, exactly. And I think that that itself is, a way to communicate meaning, and language itself is pretty much that. And in terms of how I do it, I think for me, I definitely try to consult people like yourself. I also think of my characters as everyday people. So, for instance, in my play Protest Hymns and Caskets, there was a character inspired by the life of Fumilare and Kuti, who was also part Sierra Leonean as well. And I would watch some of her speeches, and often I'd asked researcher friends for resources about her life. And one of the things I learned from her activism is that, so that she could organize with the everyday woman, so market women, rather than speaking English, she spoke in Yoruba. And I think that there's something so important about how our local languages are often used as tools for consciousness raising, and also accessibility as well. And I think that being able to bring that into a theatrical space feels like history repeating itself, in a sense, where you're inviting people to participate in the playground. And I think it's a really wonderful experience, but I think that listening is so important because language is about, we speak language, but I think there's also something important about listening to language so that we can then undo language.
There's so much to be taken from what you both said. And I was also thinking very much, Siana, about what you were saying about people opening themselves up to the experience. One of the things that really struck me when Winsome Pinnock's play Nine Night was first staged in the UK, they had to give a glossary in the programs because it was a Caribbean English that the audiences were not familiar with at that time. 25 years later, that glossary wasn't required because so many of those words have now entered the English that we speak in the UK. Some people call it a multicultural English. But there's this real sense as well that as playwrights, we hold a certain power to reflect what we're hearing around us, picking up on what was you saying about listening, but then can also help the language develop. And those words can then enter the vocabulary. I mean, I think there was 20 or 30 words this year that came from Nigerian English that entered the Oxford English Dictionary. A couple of years ago, it was Kenyan words that were entering. And so that brings me to thinking about the many Englishes. And Siana, I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit, especially with regards to your play Swim, Auntie Swim, because you had aunties who spoke different Englishes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, when I think about my aunties, it's such a delight every single time. So, in terms of just for context, for those who don't know, Swim Auntie Swim, so the central characters, there is an ensemble of four, but the three of those four are aunties from West Africa, from Ghana, from Sierra Leone, and from Nigeria. And really, it's very interesting too, because so in our cultures, we have Creoles and we have Pidgins, and they're in relationship. They're very related, but they're not exactly the same. And often people will kind of use them interchangeably, and particularly with Sierra Leonean Creole, which is called Creole, folks are kind of, they think it's a pidgin, they think it's this, and it's an amalgamation of all these things because our history means that we're an amalgamation of many people. And so you have, of course, European languages, French, Englishes, but you also have many pieces of our other neighboring like African countries like in there. And so, we're kind of masterful in that sense of being a hybrid in and of itself. So now you bring us then into a diaspora, which is, of course, a hybrid. It makes for very interesting times. But and we think about the history of that, like we needed to, because for lots of different reasons, we needed to be able to communicate with each other in harsh conditions often where we came from very diverse backgrounds and still we had to become like one people. So you see that too, like even in Swim Auntie Swim, of course they're speaking English, but the Auntie Amma from, originally from Ghana, she spends so much time with Auntie Blessing and she's picked up the little Yoruba here. She's picked up the little, dashes here and there, and she uses them herself. This is very, very like normal, very, very common. And it really does remind me of what you just said, JC, about in our kind of, if we call it multicultural English, you've got, and how it evolves and changes. Like you're having sprinkles, of course, so much patois, Jamaican patois is like in there, even if you're not Jamaican, it's part of our Black British English. But then, as you say, more of kind of like the Yoruba influences. I was saying the other day to you, there's like Arabic in there. There's all sorts of things because, again, our different cultures have sprinkled their pieces, the everyday words that we've like borrowed and turned into a whole language in and of itself. And I guess for me, it makes me think of the often the conversations I have about like, Black British identity being a real thing. It very much is a real thing and a real culture in and of itself. And actually it's been important to kind of land on that because when you are a child of the diaspora, myself being Sierra Leonean British, for example, sometimes you don't often feel like you're enough Sierra Leonean, and certainly you don't feel enough British because there's so much racialized overtones, not even undertones, like in that. So you exist in this strange, like hybrid, liminal space, and you have to make an identity of that. And that identity then has to be respected as like a real thing. And of course, these identities come with their languages and they actually come with their rules and all these kinds of things. And I'm always amazed by how we're somehow able to understand what the rules are. I'm not sure who made them, but somehow I remember at school, I was always like, how has the slang we use now changed? How did we all know that this is not the word to use anymore? You need to leave that alone. We're not saying heavy anymore. We're saying this, we're saying that, and all the schools knew. So I think in the same way that our parents, our immigrant parents, our migrant parents had to adapt and change, and language kind of came with that. I think, as however many generations of identities in this country, the children of them, we are doing like the same thing basically with our language, like in this context. So rather through Swim Auntie Swim, I was kind of like demonstrating that. But, and actually just to add as well with Swim Auntie Swim before I stop, again, we also had the aspect of like the West Midlands in there, right? It's also based in Coventry. So then we've added that level. And I'm an adopted West Midlands. I'm originally from South London, proudly, but I've lived in Coventry for over 12 years. So the sprinkles of Coventrian dialect and the sprinkles of kind of the West Midlands dialect, all of that was in there. So it just makes for a really interesting pot of food.
Lanaire, would you like to add to that pot while we're into you?
I like what you were saying about the hybridity of it all and how you have to sort of articulate that. I think that my background is that I lived in Nigeria for several years, but I was born in the UK and I've also lived in London as well for many years. But I think that I'm just a very curious person, and I try my best to just ask people questions. And again, like listening to what people are saying when I'm on the train, I overhear things and I write it down. And I think that, yeah, there's something very powerful about the fact that we're in a space that allows for that hybridity. But also it's full of contradictions as well. As you were saying earlier, Siana, it's you don't want to have to, if in sort of film sense, subtitle every single thing or translate every single thing. And I think that have been in spaces where a language hasn't been translated, and I felt something within me, and my body reacted to something. And I think that within my own work, I have tried my best to incorporate that. So, for instance, in my play Process Hymns and Caskets at the Belgrade Theatre, I I used I combined language with music. So I underscored language through music. And I think that music also is a form of language in itself. And so, for instance, we had a brilliant talking drummer called Coyote who um, would drum to underscore certain words and phrases and even use it for emphasis. And I was fascinated by the talking drum as an instrument because it's an instrument that I think is in very creative dialogue with words. And so even the fact that it's called a talking drum, a drum talks, it sounds so absurd, but I think that instruments are itself their own languages and they express something. And I think that because, for instance, Yoruba is very rhythmic and very poetic, there's something about combining that with the talking drum. And to bring back my playground analogy, I think that it's all about going to a sandpit and deciding what tools am I going to use. Am I going to use a spade or am I going to use, the sand in itself? And I think part of being a hybrid space is having to be creative, not by choice, but by necessity. And so I've had to sort of bring in different cultural experiences from, childhood experiences of seeing a talking drummer play at church to underground train conversations of hearing a mixture of sort of TikTok speak, for instance, within people my age, and bouncing that to sort of more Black British English, and then combining that with, Yoruba words or, West African words. So it's very interesting how that hybridity makes for a very creative experience, but it can also be very startling at first because you might be unsure of how to do it. But I think part of my approach to it is sort of becoming like the child again and playing and experimenting, figuring out what works. We had a lovely R&D session with, well, it was more like a reading, but I saw it as an R&D with Jen Davis, who was the director of Process Hymns and Caskets. And one of the things that I really appreciated that we did was really get the actors to immerse themselves in that world and that history. As you both mentioned, history is also very linked to language, and I think that an awareness of history itself allows one to appreciate language, and we have such a long history of that hybridity, and I think that being able to have permission to play and to experiment and to even feel as well allowed me to feel more confident in the ways in which I use language, whether it was through poetry, through music, or just sort of through everyday conversations.
I'm going to pick up on those everyday conversations because I didn't realize until now that you write down what things people say on the tube, because I do that as well. Cafes, and I find it really hard to work in public places because I find I'm spending all my time listening to what people are saying, but trying to write it down exactly as they say it. Because I love the rich sounds of exactly it as how people talk, the things they don't say, the exclamations or interjections they might use or not use. And picking up on what you were talking about, West Midlands, I had a play that was at the Arcola and also at the Oxford Playhouse called Out of Bounds. And it's set, one part of it is set in Gloucester. So I really worked with the Gloucestershire accent. And there was something so wonderful when the play was on stage, was actually hearing a Gloucestershire accent, because how often, there's certain regional accents we hear. There's some we recognize, like Yorkshire is one of the ones that, you would definitely recognize. West Midlands, again, Black country accents you'll hear. But Gloucestershire is not necessarily one that people are familiar with. So it was wonderful to kind of have that moment of people recognizing, but not quite recognizing, and drawing them into that. And also, as you said, having that courage to play with it and seeing how far can we take it.
Just that point on Worcestershire is interesting because it made me think of like the Coventry accent specifically, and kind of when we were thinking about, like I live in Coventry, so I know it now quite well, and it for me is certain words. But I would argue it's actually a very like subtle accent if you don't know, and so it's easy for people to fall into like a Brum accent, Wolverhampton, West Country, that kind of stuff, and. Dare I say it, Coventryans, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but to me, it's a lighter accent than those. So it can be quite hard to catch if you're not familiar, basically. And so that was an interesting thing we had to play with, because you want to represent. And in some ways, you're kind of needing to just like represent. Well, in some ways, we were almost like, okay, we want to represent the West Midlands, but there's, of course, diversity like in that. And it just struck me that actually, even a city like Coventry, people weren't as familiar with that accent as they were with like an obvious like Birmingham accent, obvious Wolverhampton accent. So it's really important to keep figuring out how you represent that to your, as honestly as you can, to the best of your like abilities. But that just made me think of that point.
No, it is. And it is interesting, the linguistic, we keep coming back to this word hybridity, which I think is such a powerful word, because it speaks to the many layers in which we operate in as Black diasporan writers in the UK, because there's already a huge linguistic diversity within UK accents, and then you're adding diasporan accents. And it's just, we've got so much stuff we can work with for a long time. But coming back to that point of history, one of the things, and I would love to hear what you both think, is using words to indicate particular historical periods. So as you said, Siana, in the playground or in schools, we know when slang has changed. But I wonder if, and with the historical work that you do, lanaire, do you think about, if I use this word or these phrases, it will place it in the 20s, or it will place it in the 90s, or it will place it in the 50s? Is that something that you think about?
Yeah, it's definitely. When I was writing Protest Hymns and Caskets, I was obsessed with historical accuracy. But there was also an issue I had, and I think this speaks to the sort of erasure of our history, and perhaps even the lack of access to certain histories. So a lot of the ways in which I was able to get my research was through oral histories and archival research. But at the time when I was writing Protest Hymns and Caskets, I hadn't yet gone to Nigeria to conduct that research. So I actually had to rely on my grandmother's testimony of witnessing the revolt at a very young age. And because she moved to Lagos, she's always lived in Lagos, the north of Nigeria, but also Lagos. Um, Her ways of expressing herself are unique to Lagos itself. And so what I then did was I essentially would have to read academic papers. There was a paper by Judy Byfold on the Egba Women's Revolt, and she was able to brilliantly paint a vivid picture of what Abeokuta looked like. And of course, you have Wole Soyinka's book on Abeokuta at the time. But what I had to then do was enter history and reimagine things as though they were, and that often required me, again, like playing with things and playing with syntax as well. So what that looked like practically was that I would ask a researcher friend, okay, does this sound too modern? And they'd say, actually, yes. And in those days, we'd never express ourselves this way. And I think that's probably why a lot of the words or a lot of the language I employed was Yoruba, because that felt more accurate to the world, because most people would have spoken Yoruba at the time and not English, even if they were elite or, sort of well educated. And so for me, it was just about trying my best to reimagine things and speculate, because I think part of the work we do is speculative, and also requires us to really imagine things otherwise. And I was reading I've been reading James Baldwin's essays recently, And he's been talking a lot about how writing for him is finding out what you don't want to know and what you don't want to find out. And I think that part of writing Process Hymns and Caskets was me discovering the unknown and rediscovering even the known. And I think that I will say that my process itself is very collaborative, even when I'm writing, or writing requires more solitude, but perhaps developing that piece is very collaborative. And so, having to speak with family members, like my grandmother, like my mom, to speaking with researcher friends and going into the archive. And that time it was more like academic papers and perhaps even looking at photos and thinking, these people are real people, they're characters that I could base my work on, but they're also people. How might they speak? I did watch a few videos because there were a few videos on YouTube, but the videos were mostly centered on Fumlara Kuti, who was the leader of the Abeokuta Women's Union at the time. And she speaks in a certain way because she was English educated, well, educated in the UK at some point. So I think for me, the solution was having most of my characters speak Yoruba. And I also think that perhaps, I mean, I had to reject, I mean, I had to embrace also being, not having everything perfect. I think that's something that I had to embrace because I don't know how archival research, which I didn't have at the time, in the way I wanted it. It's hard to actually write. So, for instance, if one is writing, a place set in the 15th century or whenever, you could go to the library, the British Library, and read how people speak, and you do that. But I think that unfortunately, due to again, access and also just the erasure of our histories, unfortunately, it's really hard to find those sort of primary sources. And one has to then rely on oral history. And I think oral history, during my PhD is centered on the Egba Women's Revolt, but a key part of my methodology is using oral histories. And I think that is legitimate scholarship, which has been rendered illegitimate and sort of seen as unauthorized and really unserious. And I think that mode of inquiry for me has been very helpful because where I haven't been able to look through the archives, and quote the traditional archives, so for instance, institutional knowledge and libraries, I found solace in listening to family members and also speaking with elders in communities, which I was able to do many years later when I was making my short film Record Found Here. And so, yeah, I think that it's been a beautiful process, but it hasn't been easy. I think and that is also because of the erasure of our history.
I think it's very true, and I, that tension that you brought out between oral history and written histories, it's a really fascinating one to me, particularly around the use of language, because of course, on the archive, it is somebody writing down what somebody said, so the source is still oral, and I think that that's something we really recognize in our cultures. I'm sure both of you have had experiences where you might say to somebody, in Sierra Leone or in Nigeria, oh, it's written here. They'll say, no, but I want you to tell me. We kind of tend to privilege the human being. One human being telling you is much more powerful than something that can be written down, because obviously in our histories, we know the things that were written down, often we were at the harsh end of what was written down. And so it's an interesting dance, this idea of where the truth lies, of how things sound, when we think about that tension between written and oral that you're really working with in your doctoral work.
Just to jump onto that, sorry, just because I was just thinking about, like, particularly with my process was from Auntie Swim, and actually this really does speak to a lot of our cultures, particularly the maternal lineage being like the keeper of our histories, right? And I played with this as well in one of my earlier plays, Layla, which was about a young British Sierra Leonean. Obviously, always play with that as a motif because it speaks so closely to my own experiences. But just to briefly talk about that, she's typically very uninterested in kind of her ancestral roots. She's very much from London. That's her identity. It is what it is. But she is fortunate enough to live in a multi-generational home. So her grandma does live at home. But unfortunately, her grandma passes away unexpectedly. And her grandma is the keeper of the Sierra Leonean culture in that household, because even her parents were doing the thing of, actually, we're British now and all this kind of stuff. So then, my character, Aminata, has to go on this journey unexpectedly by the demand of her grandma, who is now a ghost. and she has to go and explore like her identity and like what this means and heritage and all this kind of stuff. But it really does speak to that thing about, you know, this question. And I think we do think about this as kind of diasporans, whether you want to have kids or not, but you think about like culture, you think about language, who's going to pass it on? How do I pass it on? Like we have a bit of a joke, but it's not really a joke. Like my Sierra Leonean friends and I, that we speak Kringlish, which, you know, if you're the equivalent is like Spanglish, anything like that. But this accepting, so thinking about this thing of perfection for a long time, kind of being ashamed to try and have a go at our Creole. And actually, for many of us, that was our first language, our first English. But because your accent is so British, you just, for me personally, I just was like, I can't, I just sound terrible. I'm not going to do it. I feel embarrassed, kind of thing. And so you don't use it. You understand the language extremely well, but you don't necessarily speak it in right response. But for me, over time, actually just spending more time like with other Sierra Leoneans like myself, young Sierra Leoneans like myself particularly, and just accepting we speak Kringlish. Like we're going to speak English. We're going to dash a little bit of like Sierra Leonean Creole in here. It may sound a little bit wah-wah, but that is like, and ultimately that gives you the confidence once you kind of like claim that this is its own thing. And like it's, you know, we kind of have that, we have that now too, but it takes some time. And I think shame is like a big part of some of this conversation that we have around language. Like when you don't quite know how to access it, you're curious about it or you're not. But in my case, I came to a point of curiosity like in my older years, and then you start to think about, okay, now how do I navigate this basically? And I understand Creole very, very well. But like there are actually indigenous languages. So like Timni is one of the languages that's also part of my heritage. I don't understand that. My mum has tried. And, you know, that's something too. And I think it's been nice to see like in other cultures, it's been nice to see like in the same way, you know, you can get like on Duolingo, your French and your German and your this, whatever. Like there are similar attempts to have like our indigenous languages, Tree and, you know, Yoruba and all these kind of languages more accessible for folks to just like learn like on an app or something, or learn in community, in like workshops and things like that. So there's a lot of folks kind of like exploring that and making it accessible. And just to the point that you made, lanaire, about, you know, the communal effort, particularly of theatre, that is the nature of that genre of practice. You know, for Swim Auntie Swim, we actually held roundtables at my mum's house. That was really wonderful because, again, the central characters are women of a certain age. They are much older than myself because they are in the image of my aunties and my mother. And so it's important to like have conversations in that context with food at like mum's house and be able to interrogate. And we ended up, you know, talking for like a good 4 hours. And we were interrogating everything from like relationships, sometimes topics that your parents they don't usually speak to you about, or maybe you're privileged now to speak about it because you're older, but like talking about some really like important, intimate stuff, but also rooting it in this question, which is a central question in the play, about their relationship to water and the good, the bad, the ugly, like around that basically, and like tapping into our histories with water and our, you know, mythologies and our spiritual like connection to water, as well as the kind of like practical. So having that space and like convening with women in particular who, yes, are still very much like the keepers of our culture, that's all been an important part of the process, documenting and archiving, that then goes into like the work that we create.
And I love what you're talking about as women being keepers of the culture, especially in the context of language, because we talk about mother tongues.
Yes.
So we recognize that in the way that we define women's role with regards to language. You know, in Kenya, so the national language, which is one of my mother tongues, Swahili, is it's a language for women, and it's women who have kept that language right down to, there's a cloth, which in West Africa would probably be a wrapper, but in Kenya we call them a kanga, and there's always a phrase written at the bottom of it. So there's a long Swahili literacy around these phrases, and they're proverbs, and they're sayings, what we call misemo, and they always have more than one meaning. And women used to actually, you know, even when they were being manufactured at one point in Kenya's history in the 50s in Japan, Swahili women were in touch with the manufacturers saying, we want this particular misemo, because it was a way of communicating to their societies the kinds of things, the kinds of conversations that you're talking about that we don't normally have. So if you had a woman in the village, for example, and she was in conflict with somebody else, she might wear a kanga with a misemo that talks about, you know, when two elephants fight, what gets hurt is the grass. So there's this thing about the way in which language is living, but looking at those kangas, we also have a history of the kind of things that were being talked about going back over a century, more than that, you know, several centuries, that allow us and give us an insight into women's lives, which are therefore also the society's lives.
And that's such an important point, just across our culture. Speaking in proverbs is absolutely important. Like, so as a proverb in Creole, which translates as the same rain that beats bitter leaf until it's bitter is the same rain that beats sugarcane until it's sweet, is a central proverb and it's at the heart of the play Swim Auntie Swim. And I remember like our process of trying to decide which proverbs we were going to use, which ones really gave the essence of what we were trying to go for. Like that was a really interesting like experience as well, because I learned so much along the way, like me sitting and thinking about that, and then being in conversation with others, particularly about the cultures that were slightly outside of my own. But it's, as Africans, and actually as global majority peoples, we do speak in proverbs. We are poetic people. And those things really, really matter. And even, sometimes just as a bit of thing, we call it, maybe the more negative side of it is, how do I phrase it? So like in Syrian culture in Korea, you might say someone's them to pull hint, like they're pulling a hint or whatever. And that's basically like speaking in kind of like codes a little bit, maybe like throwing a little bit of shade again, but that is all still an art form. Like it's all, as you, even that example you gave, for me, that's a little bit of that really. She's kind of saying, look at us fighting. But it's very profound, that proverb. I've heard it before, but it's like communicating in code sometimes, because for many reasons you can't completely speak direct, so you're cutting through the
Exactly.
corners.
Exactly. Lanaire, do you use proverbs in your work, or either to sync with or as part of your process?
Yes, definitely. Some of my characters would mention these proverbs, especially with protest hymns and caskets. And I think that part of learning about the proverbs I was able to do through research by asking people like my friends or people older than me for the common proverbs that they used. I really I love hearing proverbs, and I like the collective sigh and theater that comes in the silence when someone says a really profound, proverb. And I think that it's also something that you can talk about even after the play is over, because it's unraveling and people have their different perspectives on it. And yeah, I love what you were saying, JC, also about the cloth and the cloth communicating something. I've never heard of that before. So the kanga, that's something that I'm going to never forget now. So
I mean, and I think I actually have a piece on the National Centre for Writing's website that came out of one of the readings that we were doing with the actors for Dennis Shonkler's play, A Wave of Change. And it was the very first reading, actually. And one of the actors asked, do people really speak like this? Because they hadn't been immersed in either African languages or the experience of African theatre making. And I really thought about that a lot because, yes, I mean, to me, it was like, it's obvious this is exactly how people speak. But it made me realize also some of the things that we take for granted in the richness of our language. Or languages, I should say. I've been listening to both of you talk about your process, and you're never alone in your process. And it makes me realize, how multilingual theatre, how African theatre, diasporic African theatre builds community, builds identity. Because even though at the end of the day, when the play is being shown, there might be one name on the poster, actually, there's a whole host of people whose thoughts and ideas went into this kind of the sense of creativity. Do you find that working in this way, what gifts do you think it brings in terms of for the audience and in terms of making space for African stories on the stage? What does that mean for you?
I can jump in. There's lots of gifts. I think that, for me, it's a challenging, like the industry part of theatre making is challenging, especially if you are an African storyteller, a Black woman, and have other layers of like otherwise marginalized identity. That is the first thing to say. You have to cut through a lot to be able to lift up the stories you want to lift up in the ways you want to do it, and stay authentic to your culture, to your craft, when you are not the majority. So there is a challenge there. That said, though, the beauty of the art makes it all worth it, right? And so the collaborative, because writing is very much a solitary endeavor a lot of the time, and you come and you create this world, and then to bring it to life, you need others to step in. And actually, it's interesting because when you're in anything, when you're so immersed for many years or many months, and you're the person, you know it all, it's really interesting to then take it out into the world and see how others react, and how others are like, oh, okay. And actually others might say, oh, actually that syntax or that rhythm. I don't know if that's quite right when I say it out loud as like an actor. And so can we adjust that? And then it starts to open other layers basically of how you then see your work again, I suppose. And particularly when you're bringing in many other cultures, it's important. You can research as much as you like, but it's so important to speak to people, to engage with people, to have the aunties on the phone who are Ghanaian, who are Nigerian, who can say, actually, no, it's not this, or actually, yes, it's that, basically, and call up this person and call up that person. Like, all of that is like part of the richness of the process. And also holding that not everything that you have done will go into the final form, but all of that process is still there as the seeds for everything. So it still all makes it in the end, basically, even if on paper it's not quite like documented. So the collaborative process is very, very important and helps you to see things from a different perspective. It offers kind of other ways of maybe like looking at things that you feel very fluent in because it's the world that you've built and you've created. But it has its challenges, basically. And there's definitely something about too many voices as well can be difficult when making work. So ultimately, it's also being sure about what your artistic identity is and what you're trying to communicate, basically, and why, and then being led by that so that everything else like enables that to be born.
Yeah. I love what you said, Siana, about how it's such a beautiful process. And I remember when I was younger, this is like primary school, my mom always told me, Lanaire, read the work aloud before you submit it.
Yeah, it sounds different.
Okay.
Oh,
So
so
true.
yeah, always tell me to read it aloud and then edit and submit. And I sort of brought that, lesson into now as a 20-something-year-old, and that's creating work. But with what you were saying, Sienna, about how you would consult people, I'm also the same. I remember I had a 21st century character in that play who had participated in the NSARS protest. And without spoiling the play, there was a character who was in prison, and I at the time was trying to write Pidgin, but I think that there's a difference between trying to translate what's in your head on paper to actually say it aloud. And when I wrote it on paper, I asked a friend for feedback, and she said, "Lanaire, this is not how we say it." And she was like, she actually made a joke. She said to me that my time in London has like affected the way I'm thinking, how I think about Pidgin has changed. And to be fair, I was never confident in speaking Pidgin, but I could understand it. But I thought that being able to understand meant that I could write it, which is actually untrue because sometimes exactly. But she made me confident, or rather, she supported me in filling those gaps, which was very comforting. And I felt more confident when I then got to the rehearsal process, because even during that rehearsal process, things changed. And you had another character say, actually, no, maybe this should actually be said in this way, or actually, we need a full stop here, or we need a break here. And I think that's also the beauty of working with good actors as well. Um, I was very blessed that the team that we work with actors, they were also quite skilled with the Nigerian accent as well, because accent does play a big role in the beauty of it. And I was very worried about the accents not being perfect. Um, I mean, it still wasn't perfect, but I think that is also part of again, the issues perhaps in the industry of not having actors of the global majority who get opportunities like that. And I remember one of the most um, wonderful things I got was at the end of the play. People kept telling me that they felt really happy that in their several years of acting, they were never given an opportunity to speak Yoruba or to speak Pidgin, and that opportunity itself was very rewarding for them because they got to connect with their histories and connect with their language. And it sort of reminds me of that Toni Morrison quote about how there's been a systematic looting of language. And as a result of that, we lose our nuances, our complexities, and oppressive language is then used, to replace that. And I think that the erasure of our languages, even on the stage, is itself very violent, because our languages are rendered subjugated or inferior, and that itself then reproduces more violence. And it also limits our knowledge, because the way in which we think about our world is informed by our use of language. So language itself is restricted, and so is our knowledge. And so I think that for me, it's had its pros and cons, but similar to what Sienna was saying, in that I think that collaborative process has actually made my work richer. And I know that even though I'm a writer, I would not be this person without the people around me, without my community. And I think that just speaks to how collaborative and communal Africans are. We do things with each other, and we ask for help when we need it. So yeah, I've really enjoyed the process, and I feel like I've learned so much from doing language in this way.
And I think, you talked about undoing language, and now you've said doing language. And I really feel that that's what's the fascinating about all of our processes, is that we're working with languages that in some ways have been undone and are finding our ways to doing them in community, whether it's by ourselves, in collaboration, figuring out how to get this absolutely wonderful polyphony of voices clear enough to come through singular characters. I mean,
And that clarity point is so important, JC, just to interject there, because the more you do it, so like Neri's point about, particularly good actors who are diligent enough to be able to like pull things out and question and challenge you, basically, all of that helps with that clarity and stretches you. I talk about how you get stretched in the R&D process as a writer, and it can be quite painful. But the stretching, if done well, can absolutely make sure that you and the work like emerge much richer for it and come with that sense of clarity. And actually, I just wanted to speak to that very important point you made, lanaire, about what your actors said about, in all their years, XYZ of being in the industry, whatever, and not having the opportunity to engage with their particular culture in this way. I got similar feedback like through the Swim process. And again, that speaks to more structural things there. But there is something about the gift, right, as well. Like when you write and create worlds, you do it for the reasons that you do it, but there are all these other things that come from you being able to do that, and the gift that it gives people to be able to engage. It can be quite emotional as well when they've had to maybe mask their way through an industry or mask their way through in order to kind of like make it. Then to be able to say, actually, I can go back and I can like reconnect with my language and my heritage, and maybe that opens doors for them to reconnect with parts of themselves that they have left dormant for a long time for complex reasons.
I've definitely had the same experience, of actors telling me exactly that, and in ways that I didn't expect. Very much in terms of African languages, but also return to a moment for the Gloucester accent. I found out, from in that particular play, there's a mother and a daughter, with their Gloucestershire accents, and both of them said, as actors, one of them was much more experienced than the other, but they said they had never had a chance to speak in the Gloucestershire accent, even though that's where they were from. So I think that it is about these complexities that sometimes bring us to people in ways that we wouldn't have otherwise expected. But I think it's important that we all have acknowledged the struggles around being able to make this kind of work. The idea that there isn't an audience, sometimes people say, well, who's going to come and watch this? Who's interested in these stories and these histories? What would you say to somebody who was kind of concerned that they were going to go and see a multilingual play? What would that mean? Would they understand it? What would you say to convince them to come and see it?
I'd say that there are many things in the world that we don't understand and we have to confront. And I think they should just come in there with openness and excitement and enthusiasm. I think, at every point in our lives, we do have to meet something that is perhaps unfamiliar to us. But we find that if we do so with faith and with courage, it can often be a very rewarding experience. I also think that, I'm remembering this, it's now become a meme, but this idea of Europe not being the sun. And I think it was by the Senegalese filmmaker, I forget his name now.
Osman said
But
then?
yes, that's him. Yes. And he's saying that we should remember that we are the sun. And I think that it's also okay for you to not be the focus of everything. I think that it's okay for you to be outside, for a change, and that itself is a wonderful space because you're able to see things differently. You're able to learn. I think there's something beautiful about being a learner, and I would say that just come with an open heart. And I think that you'd find that there is so much beauty in not being able to be at the center of things. And perhaps that's also because a lot of the stories that we work with are stories that are located at the margin, and we're constantly having to pull them to the center and claim it as central when it's at the margin. And to borrow that, Toni Morrison quote, but I think that there's something so beautiful about just the discomfort. I think the discomfort is fine, sit in that discomfort, and you might find that there are actually beautiful things that you learn about yourself, about other people, and about the world from doing that. So come with an open heart is what I'd say.
You said it beautifully, but exactly that, just to add to that, very much actually Bell Hooks talks a lot about from the margins to the center. And, I talk about that. That's central to my pursuit really as a storyteller, no matter what form that takes. Come and understand and embrace that art, whatever form it takes, is a portal. And so actually you're being transported somewhere. And maybe for that moment, as lanaire says, you're not the center of it, and that's okay. So I think it's very much coming with that open mind. Actually, to be able to access art in its fullest beauty, you have to be open. So there's nothing to worry about. There's no needs to worry. If anything, come and expect that you might be curious enough to want more and to learn more. And I actually just, thinking about kind of one of the reasons why I'm multidisciplinary by necessity is that I think a lot about kind of, my work is very much like looking at state violence, right? Looking at really big, gnarly questions that, you protest, you go on the front lines, you march, you do this, you do that. And yes, that is received in certain ways, as we kind of know. And actually, there's a point where folks just shut down and kind of stop listening to you, and you get dismissed as kind of a social justice warrior. But there's something about, okay, can you say the same thing again differently? And so for me, without giving too many spoilers with Swim Auntie Swim, it's very much a continuation of the work that I'm always doing. So on the one hand, that's centering voices and experiences that are traditionally marginalized and pulling them from the margins to the center, right? In the case of our aunties, for example. But a particular character goes through something extremely harrowing, and she embodies the many women, mothers, sisters, aunties that I spoke to and have organized with and alongside and behind over the last decades, basically, when it comes to state violence and deaths in custody, for example. So there's a character, one of my characters is very much portraying that amalgamation of different women who have a story to tell. Then maybe the audiences that come to see the work, they might have actually in their own homes, they might have a particular view of when they read certain headlines in the news. But my hope is that actually, having met my character and known the story of her son, that maybe in the ways that maybe my other tactics don't work, maybe that coming and embracing and listening through theatre, maybe the next time they see those same kind of headlines, they stop and think about Fatu and Ishmael, and maybe in the conversation their household will be quite different than how it has been in the past. And to me, that makes the world of difference. So art is political, whether folks want to embrace it or not, and it's a tool among many to be able to communicate. And whether it's poetry, whether it's theater, artists are very essential to our revolutions, very essential to the awakening in our consciousness, basically. And we're very essential to the archiving and documenting of our time. Nina Simone reminds us of our duties to do that. So for me, that art is a portal, and not just through time, but through the many different states of being as a human being.
I really love what you said about that portal, and the way that both of you have also referenced poetry, because I think this is the point at which I might have a little teaching point, and that African theatre has always embraced poetry within it, and has always been a multi and interdisciplinary in the way that it functioned. It functioned as a court in history. It functioned, as you said, as an archive, a way for people to be able to tell and share their stories and hopefully bring that understanding that you so beautifully described. One of the things that struck me after a wave of change was shown at German Street Theatre was one of the audience members came up to me and said, I had a Kenyan friend who used to tell me the stories of when he was in school in Kenya. And she said, they were amazing stories, but I always felt there was something that I wasn't quite getting. And she said, but now seeing this play, she said, I can't wait to see him again because I fully understand it now. I've been able to see what it was he was talking about through the experience of that play. So I think what I'm hearing from you both, tell me if I've got this wrong, is we're actually talking about the way in which multilingual theatre, by doing and undoing and then redoing language, actually forms a kind of bridge between all of these different communities through time and space, and just allows us to be able to connect with each other.
Summarized beautifully. And it means that, and because again, we always hear there's this like need for like universalism, whichever the word is, of our stories, which sometimes is important to push back and say, no, actually, the context is really specific. Like, it's very much West African, but that does not mean folks can't take something from it, right? And that's the thing about what we're talking about, that shifting whose center is what, who is the sun. We're often expected to be able to universalize our experiences through a European lens, through a white lens, and then actually being able to say, actually, you can still learn from me. You can still learn from us. And you can still see, like, one of the things I've absolutely loved about the Swim Swim experience is the way that aunties of all creeds and colors have seen themselves in these characters, right? And that was one of my hopes as well, that you would have like aunties from whatever culture come and like be like, oh, that's me, or oh, that's her, or and be able to see themselves in those characters, because again, there's some specificities because of culture and traditions, but the human condition in many ways is universal, and it just has all these kind of different flavors, right, and nuances. But yeah, we're absolutely, as you say so brilliantly, JC, it's all about being a bridge in the end.
And I mean, thank goodness for those nuances and those cultural differences and those complexities, because the world, quite frankly, would be very boring if we were all the same. So, I I want to thank you so much for taking part in this conversation, and thank you for the thoughts and the insights, and also how generous you've been with sharing your process. Because so often, we talk about the art, but actually for people to be able to hear what it's like to get into the weeds, is really a great offering. So thank you for that. And I also want to thank Kate Griffin and the people who were behind the Visible Communities residency. It was an amazing and in many ways quite transformative experience for me. And to thank Martin, who's done the tech, because without the tech, we would not be able to reach you. And the National Centre for Writing for the work that they do to support the many different Englishes and languages all around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, JC. Thank you for hosting a beautiful conversation.